Well, we will start with the presentation Virginia Woolf, Suicidal Characters, Schizophrenia, and the Rebellion Against the Self and the Body in her literary works by Diego Carretero Román. Diego is a young PhD candidate who, after a period of independent research, started last year a PhD in literary studies at University Complutense of Madrid. He is specialized in English literature with a deep interest in postmodernist and postcolonial literature. His thesis studies schizophrenia in modern and contemporary literature from a post-structuralist perspective, analyzing different genres and trends and considering also gender, sexuality, migration, and post-colonial studies. So, Diego, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Josefa, for this introduction, and also mainly for organizing this conference and the book that will follow. Okay, let me first of all show my presentation. Okay, let me know if you can see it now. Yeah,
Yes,
okay, perfect. Excellent, excellent. Okay, so as Josefa said, I'll be presenting this paper on Virginia Woolf's suicidal character, but I'll be focusing mostly on her fictional characters rather than on her biographical fact about her. Okay, so just to give you some insight about the structure that will follow this presentation. First of all, I will show you a bit about the theoretical framework I've been using, which is mainly literary studies, but also post-structuralism, gender theory, and medical humanities. I'll tell you a bit about this medical humanities discipline, because it's on the rise and maybe it's a bit unknown for some people, whereas the rest of them, seeing the panels that they've been presenting, I'm sure they're familiar with. Okay, so in Virginia Woolf's fiction, there are two suicidal characters. They are Septimus in Mrs. Dalloway and Rhoda in The Waves. This doesn't mean that I will only talk about these two characters, because there is notions about biopower or necropower that apply to the other characters as well. Okay. Finally, we'll move on to see into different views on Virginia Woolf's suicide case history, and we'll see the parallels between her fiction and her final suicide and her pathological history. Okay, so I would like to start with a quote from Virginia Woolf herself, from her text on being ill, that somehow illustrates the motivation for my paper. It goes as follows. Considering how common illness is, how tremendous the spiritual change that it brings, how astonishing when the lights of health go down, the undiscovered countries that are then disclosed. When we think of this, as we are so frequently forced to think of it, it becomes strange indeed that illness has not taken its place with love and battle and jealousy among the prime themes of literature. So why focusing on illness? Well, my study focuses on the origin of the suicidal character. There is the sociological explanation rather than the act of suicide itself, which is mostly approached from a psychological point of view. And then we need to shift the focus to the disease itself rather than suicide, which is the ultimate consequence. Well, now to analyze the problematics of medical humanities, because it's, as I said, it's a discipline that is on the rise, and it's mostly interdisciplinary, and it includes approaches from different disciplines, which include narrative medicine, cultural studies, medical anthropology, ethics, economics, philosophy, gender theory, etc., etc., etc. But however, one of the gaps that I have found when researching mental illness in medical humanities is the fact that they focus mostly on physical disease and its impact on mental health, rather than researching mental health by itself. So there are some lacunae in mental illness, and there's two concepts that have been intriguing me in the last few months, really, which are the pathologization of abnormality, which is something that Foucault already talks about in his History of Sexuality, but has not been really approached by medical humanities yet, I think. And then whether we can conceive mental illnesses as ecopathologies. What are ecopathologies? They are diseases which come from a toxic cultural environment. So just like we could talk about respiratory diseases caused by pollution as being ecopathologies, my point is that maybe there is a certain degree of mental illnesses that could be considered as ecopathologies as well. Okay. Okay, so now to start on how we conceptualize madness and what it's supposed to be in the 20th century mainly, and also in our century. This quote from the Anti-Oedipus from Deleuze and Guattari illustrates quite well that the fact that madness is not, as they say, is not necessarily to be ill, notwithstanding that in our culture the two categories have become confused. As they conclude, our sanity is not true, meaning that the madness is somehow constructed from the outside to, in Foucault's term, discipline the individual and subjected to the power in general terms. Yeah. Okay. So, agenda theory has seen personal as something political. That's something that we'll be playing here as well. To see how characters, selves, and identities are constructed politically in these two novels, in Mrs. Dalloway and in The Waves. So, in the case of Septimus, gender and psychiatry are definitely two things to. The psychiatric institution is definitely plays an active role in his suicide and in his treatment, whether we can regard that as treatment or not, and gender as well. So Septimus is the embodiment of the schizophrenic par excellence, who loses his identity, has hallucinations, hears voices, talks to himself out loud, even in public, and ultimately, as psychiatric treatment turns against him, he commits suicide. In many moments in Mrs. Dalloway, Septimus feels like life is out of his control, that, as he says, by another hand, strings were pulled, shutters moved, and he, having nothing to do with it, yet stood as the opening of endless avenues down which, if he chose, he might wander. Well, in the case of Rhoda, there is a more complex exercise of bio and necropower that we'll see later. So Septimus perhaps is a bit more obvious of the clinical case. Okay. Sorry, let me just go back here. Okay. Okay, so in Septimus, we see a loss of identity as he comes back from war, from the First World War, in which he was soldier, and obviously he saw the lives of his fellows, and especially his officer Evans, that were taken away. So this led to some kind of first schizophrenic disorder, in which he has hallucinations of Evans going to him and the dead people rising and talking to him constantly. Which eventually end in hearing voices telling him to kill himself, really. But it doesn't mean that Septimus is a completely dysfunctional character after work. He does marry an Italian woman, Crecia, and then when she wants to have children, Septimus is very much reluctant about it, because he sees the world as bearing too much suffering, and perhaps not himself as the ill person. He sees the world as the source of illness itself. So perhaps in that sense, that's when we can start talking about ecopathology in Septimus' schizophrenia. At some point, Septimus was deserted because of his psychiatric treatment, which was imposed to him by the doctors, by different psychiatrists, and so he couldn't be with his wife, and that's when he loses complete he is completely detached from reality at that point, and that's when he commits suicide. Up until that point, what we have is in the Los and Guattari's concepts, trans-alive death. He's not completely alive and he's not completely dead. He is the product of this gender performativity and performative acts. Okay, so what we see in Mrs. Dalloway then is how madness is constructed and conceptualized is through the omnipresence of war and death. That's something that touches both Septimus and Mrs. Dalloway herself. They say that everyone has friends who were killed in the war. Then, yeah. So when Septimus comes back from the war, he said, well, it said that it was cowardly for a man to say that he would kill himself. But Septimus had fought. He was brave. He was not Septimus now. So we see in this quote these loss of identity that is set to Septimus being suffering from, and then how we can only understand masculinity insofar as he is brave, but not when he comes back from his duty as a brave man from the war, and he is very much destroyed in a way. Okay. Another topic that we can see is the historization of women's bodies in Mrs. Dalloway. Why? Because apart from Septimus as a schizophrenic, we could talk about Mrs. Dalloway as a schizophrenic herself. And there's many critics that say that Mrs. Dalloway and Septimus are two sides of the same coin. So what happens to Septimus resembles what happens to Mrs. Dalloway herself. How does it work? Well, there's plenty of theory about Foucault. Actually, this concept of historization of women's bodies comes from his history of sexuality. Mainly, there is this point, let's see, okay, in which Clarissa is reflecting on death and the death of Septimus without knowing him. She says that death is an attempt to communicate. So instead of being a complete madness, she has seen death as something perhaps more rational. And then she realizes that she must have perished as well because of her the similar conditions in which she has been living. That somehow it was her disaster, her disgrace. It was her punishment to see sink and disappear. Here a man, there a woman, in this profound darkness. So again, the omnipresence of death everywhere, both because of the war and also because of perhaps the lack or the next politics, we could say. And then again, she says that she did not pity him. Again, she is not saying, "Oh, poor Septimus, he killed himself. What a irrational thing to do." She is somehow comprehensive. She felt she felt somehow very, very like him. She felt glad that he had done it. So in a way, she is desiring, or she is slightly suicidal herself. But then that's when she's in her party and going back to her social relationships, to her husband. And again, here the difference between Septimus being deserted and being alone, and then Clarissa being in the party with all her social relationships, somehow forcing her to stay alive, but not forcing her, rather just drawing her back to reality, the reality that Septimus has lost track, really. Okay. Okay, so again, these are the parallels between Clarissa and Septimus, and then there is a clear agency of the psychiatric institution in Mrs. Dalloway as a treatment that is imposed on Septimus, ultimately causes his death. Up until the point in which he is isolated for this cure, this treatment, Septimus was schizophrenic, he was having hallucinations, but he was not suicidal. So there is some kind of agency in his suicide. That is the psychiatric institution. Okay. Okay, now moving on to the ways in which biopower and neck power are exerted in a bit more of a complex way, not so obvious as the psychiatric institution does in Mrs. Dalloway. Okay, so Bernard and Rhoda, there are six main characters, and one of them is Rhoda, the woman, girl woman, because she grows as they grow up during the novel, who commits suicide in the end. And it's been said that Bernard and Rhoda represent the life-death duality in Virginia Woolf's vision of life. Because Rhoda is unable to accept the conditions and limitations imposed upon human beings by the physical nature of their existence. Now, I'm a bit, I don't know, I distrust whatever it has the word nature in it. So I think that instead of Rhoda being unable to accept the conditions imposed by nature, she is very disgusted by society itself and its cruelty, and we could talk in a wide way. She's disgusted about capitalism and London's life, embodying this capitalist model. So, how am I doing? Do you have time or? Okay, yeah. Okay, so Rhoda eventually becomes the body without organs that Deleuze and Guattari mention in their Anti-Oedipus. She commits suicide, but not as much as a desire for death or for suicide itself. It's rather that, okay, let me see, yeah. Okay. Well, the Deleuze and Guattari says is that the body without organs is the model of death, and I'm going to skip to the main part. It is catatonic schizophrenia that gives its model to death zero intensity. So when there is no desire, as Rhoda fails to achieve some kind of identity as a woman mainly, then she becomes this body without organs. There is only death that desires by virtue of the body without organs. And again, what happens to Rhoda is that as all the different characters start developing different personalities, we have on the one hand Susan, which embodies the performative ideal of the mother. She becomes a mother quite early. She wants to be like her mother, so she is constantly focused on that goal. Something happens to her that she realizes once this goal is achieved, she is empty as well. So it's not as easy as saying that, well, she is satisfied. No, Susan is not satisfied either. And then the other woman in the waves, Ginny, she is more like the new woman who feels free to use her body and sexuality in a way. But then Rhoda is nowhere. There's no archetype for her to follow. There is no other alternative. So somehow she's left outside the binary gender. She doesn't feel like she is like Susan or Ginny or anyone else. Okay. Now to go back to the theoretical part of the theoretical aspects of suicide and necropower, there is. I'm talking here about two main approaches to suicide, which are Foucault in the history of sexuality, and then Attila Bembe in necropolitics. There are two ways in which we can see suicide. The first one is as a self-punitive suicide, the product of psychic repression. It is the subjugation to biopolitics and necropolitics, which means that instead of having society disciplining the individual, in this case Rhoda or Septimus, they would kill themselves without the need of society to intervene. So they intervene through their own minds. Second, so this is what Foucault calls the ancient right to take life or let live, was replaced by a power to force that life or disallow it to the point of death. So there is necropolitics, even if Foucault doesn't use this term, there's necropolitics in biopolitics. And then second approach we could see in suicide is an ultimate exercise of power over the self, the rebellion against the body and its politics. This is mainly formulated by Bembe, who says that referring to the practice of individual or mass suicide by slaves, he's talking about slaves in plantations, concerned by these life captures, Gilroy suggests that death, in this case, can be represented as agency. For death is precisely that from and over which I have power, but it's also the space where freedom and negation operate. So this means that again, suicide is not the act of madness, is not self-punitive. It means that it's the last exercise of power done by the individual to rebel against such society that has led him or her to that state of slavery. And we could discuss whether in modern times we live and there's some kind of slavery or not, but there is definitely some parallels. Okay, now to turn to Virginia Woolf's own life, there are initial and contemporary views on her suicide. There's the coroner's verdict, which obviously at first dictated that she was mad. She was, sorry, let me read it. The coroner's verdict of suicide, while the balance of her mind was disturbed, and the assumption is that if you commit suicide, you must be crazy, because if you weren't crazy, you wouldn't commit suicide. But then in a recent documentary and her biographer, one of the predominant biographers of Virginia Woolf, Román and Lee, and then all the people in the documentary that seem to be related to Virginia Woolf through friendship or family, see suicide as an act of courage and brevity, not an act of madness. And so taking again the agency of the suicide and the political implications of this. Okay. Now finally to see some of Virginia Woolf's mental illness. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so in her diaries and in their analysis of her diaries, the biographies, we can see, or the common belief is that Virginia's life was marked by traumas, marked by the early deaths of a lot of family members, then the breakthrough of the First World War, the Spanish World War, in which one of her cousins died as well, and also the sexual harassment inflicted on her by two half-brothers when she was 6 years old and when she was 17, 18 years old. So this kind of can result into her, say, unstable mental state. Okay, let me find just the split. Okay, so and again the parallels with the characters in it is in Mrs. Dalloway we see Septimus surrounded by death as well and haunted by those ghosts of dead people, and pathological history as well when she was forced to rest as well and not to write. Perhaps these treatments didn't actually didn't improve her state, but make it worse, just like it is Septimus' case in Mrs. Dalloway. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Diego. Oh, I'm listening to me myself. So, Diego, please, could you switch your microphone? Oh, thank you. Thank you so very much. It was really interesting. I'm sure everybody's going to have a lot of questions to ask to you. So, please, who want to start? Do you have questions for Diego? You can write them on the chat box, or you can raise your hand, or simply open your microphones. Well, I have a comment. I hate when people in conferences start saying, I have a commentary, not a question. but I have a commentary because I was thinking of boredom. It's I cannot do it. I was thinking of boredom all the time, especially at the beginning of your presentation. But I will give priority to Josie, who has her hand raised. Josie, please.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, it was a really nice presentation. So my question is that you talk about this idea of how medical intervention in Septimus's case increased his propensity to give in to suicide instead of helping him get better. So do you think that this also resembles the medicalization of mental illness at present, like anti-psychiatric theory would insist, or do you think there is scope in medicalization of mental illness?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I couldn't hear it well. There is noise in my throat. Sorry.
Uh, should I repeat it or should I write it?
No, just repeat it. It should be alright.
Right. So you talk about this idea of how medical intervention in Septimus's case increases his propensity to suicide instead of helping him get better. So, do you think this also resembles the medicalization of mental illness at present, as anti-psychiatric theory would insist, or do you think there is still scope in there is some scope in medicalizing mental illnesses and thus offering psychiatric treatments?
Sorry, I'm very sorry, but I don't think I understand the question. I have slept very little today, so maybe I'm not understanding well. Sorry.
Maybe Josie, you can write it on the chat box, and if we
I'll
don't have,
I'll try right now. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about it, really.
yeah, and if we don't have time to read it right now, no problem at all, because we will have time. Okay. Yeah, Juanito Raspe said, try to write it down here. Yes, because sometimes in this kind of encounters, there are people from every place in the world. And Josie, in fact, is speaking from India. So the connection sometimes could be failing. Okay, since we just have 2 minutes remaining to start with the next presentation, I just wanted to say, to highlight that I wrote down one of the sentences in your presentation that said, when the lights of hell go down, when the lights of hell go down. I was thinking on how medical conditions as could be the reason for committing suicide, because as you probably know, I work in on the from a how to say, with people living in nursing home from a gerontological and geriatric perspective, and it's amazing how older adults are currently committing suicide just as a mean to escape their physical conditions, and sometimes it's so difficult to understand that reason, because one can think, okay, but maybe you need to have some clarity in your mind in order to make that decision, to take the agency of putting an end to your life. So I'm not talking about older adults living with dementia, for example, but people that, for example, are living with reduced mobility and cannot do the things that they usually done when they were younger. And it's for many people, it's very difficult to understand why you can make that decision if your mind is still working, and say, okay, but there are a lot of things you can still do, uh, such as reading a book, or well, unless you are blinded, but you can listen to the radio, you can keep conversations, very interesting conversations with other people, and so on. And I think this is one of the points surrounding that issue. of euthanasia. Don't you think so? So I would like to talk a little bit about boredom, but there's no time. But just because regarding this concept of ecopathology, which I have never listened to before, ecopathology, I was thinking that boredom, as you probably know, became a real disease from the 19th century to the present, in fact. And it was curious because boredom was said to be the mal du siècle. My pronunciation of French language is awful, I'm sorry. The mal of the century, the disease of the century, in English is better. So I was thinking that, in fact, it was the context itself which led to an unbearable boredom that we finally somatize in physical pathologies. So it was not a disease itself, but the somatization of of something else. But well, maybe we have time to speak about that later. I have to present the next speaker right now. I'm sorry. Thank you so very much, Diego. Thank you so very much. We will keep in touch.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Myriam Rodríguez del Real. She is a student in the last year of philosophy, or maybe have you finished the degree right now?
I have to present the TFG, but the exams are finished.
Okay, congrats. So, she is also graduated in journalism and audiovisual communication. She is a co-founder of Colectivo Mentes Inquietas, which is very famous in Spain. It's a space created in the social networks for the dissemination of philosophy in both social networks and outside of them through workshops, sorry, like such as La Corrala, the Institut Francais, and various bookstores. So she's in charge of divulgating, transmitting philosophy to the population. She has published several academic articles as well as periodical, which with editorial SM, Generation Go, and occasional collaborations in La Trivial, Público, or Phil and Co., which I repeat are all of them very famous in Spain. She has 2 published philosophical books, Y Pensar para Cuándo, and which can be translated as something like thinking or when. I'm not sure if this is the best translation in the world. And Mentes Inquietas. Her presentation is entitled Simone Weil, Martyr or Suicide, Between Martyrdom and Suicide, the question of the meaning of life and death. Thank you, Myriam. It's your turn.
Good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank Josefa Ros for allowing me to be part of this conference and giving me the space to speak about this impressive thinker, Simone Weil. I would also like to thank those of you who are listening us from home. I hope it will be a very fruitful conference. From now on, we are going to talk about the death of Simone Weil, which created so much debate, and try to answer the question of whether Weil was a suicide or a martyr, reviewing these 2 concepts from an ontological point of view. So, on 1943, August 26th, at the Grosvenor Sanitarium in London, the coroner completed a report of a patient who had died 2 days earlier. This person was Simone Weil. The report stated that the cause of the death was a cardiac arrest due to muscular degeneration of the myocardium as a result of starvation and pulmonary tuberculosis. But there was also the following statement by a way of a moral judgment that said, the deceased caused her own death by stopping eating while she was losing her mental equilibrium. There have been many attempts to dismantle the figure of Simone Weil and to take away her authority, especially her mystical experiences, by insinuating that she lacked mental equilibrium and considering these mystical experiences to be hallucinations. She is described as a mystic who participated in the labor movement, who didn't withdraw into the silence of religious life. And there is a desire on Weil that both her life and her theory should be ethically committed to the transformation of reality. Thus, her thought would not only remain on the theoretical level, would also become action movement, giving her body into the battle in several locations, into the factory with the workers, into the streets, etc. Simone Weil's historical context is of great importance, not only for understanding her life, but also her decisions, her thought, even her death. Joseph Otton is one of the experts of Simone Weil, and he says that our thinker was a witness to the main events of the first half of the 20th century, the First World War, Stalinism, the crisis of 1929, fascism and Nazism, the Spanish Civil War, and also the Second World War. During the Second World War, near the time of her death, she was part of the French resistance in London. Throughout her life, she wanted to be close to the oppressed, not only spiritually, but also physically. And that is why Weil refused any kind of privilege, even in the last days of her life. Her detachment from herself and her body was combined with her vocation for the other, for the afflicted, and her desire to be a desire of those who suffer the most. In English, they traduce the concept malheur, which is kind of disgrace for affliction. So we are going to talk about affliction. This thinking and desire made her to give up good living conditions for the sake of others. For example, she donated part of her food ration to people who were in greater need than she was. Also, she refused to eat more food than her fellow French soldier could eat. In the introduction of The Need for Roots, the Spanish edition, Juan Ramón Capella describes her as a person who always identified herself to the core with the excluded, the humiliated, those who bore the burden of injustice and inequality, that is, the multiform suffering humanity. So we should ask ourselves, did she let her die, or did she die because of her poor health? Well, the answer of this question is only one reading among many, as her end has been so much debated and it's difficult to classify. As we said, her end it's marked by poor physical conditions due to a prolonged state of headaches and a diagnosis of tuberculosis, but also for an aestheticism and political solidarity with the French workers. On the other hand, it becomes a little clearer that it makes less sense to talk about suicide in Simone Weil, given what we have been discussing. In fact, Weil didn't reject pain and suffering. Instead, from the experience of her own suffering, she opened herself up to the pain of the others, a pain that she wanted to share and accompany from a life without luxuries. Francisco Fernández Buey says in his work sobre Simone Weil, El compromiso con los desdichados, that no other 20th century thinker had been able to understand suffering and affliction in the way that Weil did. This understanding undoubtedly has a religious and mystical dimension, but what is genuine about Weil is that this was never disconnected from social concern. Weil is said to have self-inflicted pain. At the point, reasons led her not much her own suffering for suffering to accompany suffering of others by appropriating it. Weil says, suffering all over the world obsesses and oppresses me to the point of nullifying my faculties, And the only way I can overcome the obsession is to surrender myself in some way to danger and adversity. All in all, we turn to the question of whether Weil was a suicide or a martyr, or perhaps neither. But I would like to point out that this is not a matter of establishing a moral judgment on the question, but of providing us with some tools to be able to make a reading of Weil's death, one of many. So first of all, we will try to rethink the term suicide and martyrdom outside the Christian dichotomous coordinates, where the martyr is the one who gives his life for God and therefore a hero, and the suicide is a coward that doesn't love life. The beginning of our life is not a choice of free will, but we fall into the world, a world that constitutes us as being in the world, without which our existence wouldn't be possible. But we must turn to the question of the essence in order to ourselves about suicide and martyrdom. And clarify, we don't choose in our life. We must ask ourselves whether there is freedom to choose the end of it. Radicati, in his philosophical dissertation on death, makes a defense of suicide by appealing to the free will of the individual to choose his or her own death. So we don't know if suicide is a free choice. Suicide is the act of ending one's own life because one considers non-existence more satisfying, reassuring, in conclusion, better than existence. This is due, in the most cases, to situations of extreme suffering, whether physical or psychological, which prevents the person from living a life in a dignified and fulfilling way, and therefore creates a desire for it to end. The problem is that defending suicide as a free act should lead us to be able to affirm that each person enjoys total dominion, ownership, and sovereignty over his or her own person. And to affirm this wouldn't be not only innocent but wrong, because first of all, we live in a society and we are codependent beings. That means that we depend on each other for our existence. And secondly, because it would mean denying that there are a series of material conditions that shape our economic, cultural, religious context and determine in a positive or a negative way the opportunities that we offer or the decisions that we make. In both cases, suicide and martyrdom, that is not something that is desired per se. Even though in the case of the suicide, the person causes herself or himself to die, and in the case of martyrdom, is an external agent who performs the act of ending his life, but it is a decision that is taken given a situation in which living is not an option for different reasons respectively, reasons that are external agents in both cases. In the case of suicide, because life has been stripped of all meaning, and in the case of martyrdom, because someone external wants to strip his meaning of a life that is outside himself, that is beyond the martyr. That way, suicide is an act that is for oneself and whose case doesn't transcend the I. Rather than the meaninglessness in which the suicide seems to be lodged and which leads him to the end of his life, if there is a meaning, this meaning doesn't transcend the I. So this is precisely the lack of meaning that gives meaning to suicide, to free oneself from the bonds of a society that suffocates us. On the other hand, the case of the martyr is a case that transcends the self, that looks at the face of others and goes out of itself. It opens up to the completely other and recognizes in his outside of itself a meaning that surpasses it and goes beyond itself. A meaning that is what constitutes his life and therefore for which he is ready to die. So in this way, the martyr is resistance, life that rises upon life. The martyr doesn't want to die, but an external agent imposes this choice on him. This decision makes him choose between his life, but renouncing this other, which transcends him and shapes his meaning or death. So the martyr responds by donating his life for this meaning cause against the power that tried to impose the meaninglessness on his life. So he actually gives life for life because his death transcends death through that cause or meaning. Chesterton says in his work Orthodoxy, a martyr is someone who appreciates what surrounds him so much that he renounces his own life. He is noble exactly because, however much he renounces the world or execrates all humanity, he admits that last link with life. He dies so that something may live. Thus, the difference between these two figures is not in the question of the act, it's not the performance of the act or the hands that do it, whether their own or someone else's, nor whether it is a free act or not, or whether there is a meaning in the act itself that differentiates suicide from martyrdom. Instead, it is the question of the transcendence of the cause of the meaning that guides the act that establishes a radical distance between the two. That is, the question of a meaning that is outside oneself in the case of martyrdom, or the non-transcendence of meaning, which doesn't transcend the suicide, but remains in the eye. So, returning to Simone Weil, I don't intend to conclude the debate on her death, but to draw a concrete reading that moves away from the idea that Weil wished to die and was therefore a suicidal. A more widespread reading that moves away from the image of Weil as suicidal is the one that focuses on the fact that the meaning that grown through Weil's life and death was located outside herself, transcending her person in the search for justice for the oppressed, for those who suffered the most. Also, she was a person of great moral rigidity and the obligation to stand by the side of the suffering and not to allow herself better living conditions that they could have was a moral imperative. In her friend Simone Petremont's Life of Simone Weil, a work that traces the entire life of our philosopher from a privileged position because she was a friend of hers, Petremont collects the next sentence of Simone Weil. I ardently desire to do whatever is required of me without any privilege. I desire that my time and my course of my thoughts, insofar as they depend on the body, be subjected to the same necessities that any foreign labor suffers. Weil also says in a letter to Father Perrin about her experience in the factory, my soul and my body were in pieces. Contact with affliction, malheur, had killed my youth. Until then, I had had no experience of affliction, except my own, which being my own, seemed to me of little importance. I knew very well that there was so much affliction in the world. I was obsessed with it, but I have never experienced it by prolonged contact. This experience made her be aware of the condition of human affliction existing in a world plagued by affliction and suffering. In her work, Discovered Thoughts, Weil will say that to project our being onto the disgraced is to assume their affliction, although this has only been realized by Christ on the cross. For Weil, this struggle for justice is translated into a desire to give one's life to the love for the other and communing with the suffering of the other. In words of Christ, I was hungry and you gave me to thirsty and you gave me to drink. On the other hand, it is of great interest to pay attention to the concept of decreation, which she introduces in her work Gravity and Grace. This idea allows us to establish a certain parallelism between the figure of Christ and Simone Weil. God's creation, says in this text, is an act of complete love. And it is precisely in this act of God's love that he decreates, he withdraws so that we can love him. That is, he renounces his omnipotence in order to endow us with freedom and autonomy so we can choose to love him. In the act of creating, God divested himself of part of his being. He decreated himself, and Weil will say, God gave me being in order that I should give it back to him. Also, Weil distinguishes between destruction, which is to make the created pass into the nothingness, and decreation, which is to make the created pass into the uncreated. And here we can see the distance between suicide and martyrdom that we were talking about. So we should renounce to be something of our own by imitating this divine act. The Bible says, Christ, being divine, emptied himself, that is kenosis, by taking the form of a slave. So we are here to respond to the renunciation to God's sacrifice with our renunciation and sacrifice. That means to make ourselves nothing in God, as Christ did on the cross and as Weil did in her last days of her life. I don't think I see in Weil's words a kind of apology or a desire for death, but rather a total abandonment in God, an abandonment and a renunciation that consists in, and this is the key point of my talk, being an instrument of his love, of God's love. And this is shown with great clarity in her dedication to the most afflicted. It is said in the Acts of Apostles, in him we live and move and have our being. So Jesus becomes flesh to accompany the unhappiness, the human suffering that is the condition of our existence in a world mired in disgrace. Thus, we can also see in Weil us taking up the baton of Christ's way and becoming flesh in human misery, accompanying it in an incarnate way, not so much out of a desire for masochism or absolute self-contempt, but out of a love for the other and a desire for justice and goodness. The key is to understand Weil as imitating Christ himself, who is God decreated, divesting him out of love and becoming incarnate in order to accompany the human pain in a suffering existence in the same way as Weil will do. For this reason, and according to the difference between suicide and martyrdom that we have established, we cannot speak of suicide as such, since the meaning, the cause, it is situated outside herself, and we can locate it in her desire to detach herself from the self to the others through Christ. So I think we have been able to trace her through her work and writings, not a serial of suicidal ideas that might give us clues to a kind of will to end her life, but on the one hand, this detachment from her individual and bodily existence through the concept of recreation, and secondly, this surrender to the pain of the other, both of which together with Weil's moral rectitude, led her to a total surrender of her individual life. Weil says in the Need for Roots, however beautiful the intonation of a cry of pain may be, one cannot wish to hear it any longer. It is more humane to wish to heal the pain. And that is why we can conclude that Simone Weil was a martyr. Thank you so much.
I was wondering all the time if you are gonna say the last word in this regard, and I just had the question. But Myriam, according to your view, only your view, is she a martyr or a suicidal? But
Of course, she was a martyr, and I think the key is in her concept of the creation that she writes in Gravity and Grace, and is both dimension of her life, that the social concern, that it was her political position, and also her mystical experience, her religious dimension, that made her think that the meaning of her life was to be an instrument of God's love by standing by the side of the ones that suffer the most. And this is why in the end of her life, she doesn't she didn't want to eat more food that the people that were on the war defending France, and also the workers in the factory. So I think this is the key points, the two key points of why, for me, Simone Weil is a martyr.
Thank you so very much for such an insightful and wonderful presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. Do you have any question for Myriam? Yes, Leonor?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I don't know if I'm going to be able to express myself correctly in English because I don't know. But I'll try. I don't know if I quite agree with this comparison between martyrdom and suicide, because as I see it, suicide is always a meaningful statement. It's a way to make from a meaningless circumstance, that is death, a meaningful act. I see this difference between where is the meaning, inside the subject or outside. Like suicide is always like a self-determination act. And here I see a very important point in the difference between the German terms Freitod and Selbstmord. Selbstmord is like auto, how do you say that? Auto killing or something like that. And Freitod is like free death. That in martyrdom, what I don't quite understand is how can you be instrument of God if you are not living? I mean, I understand martyrdom as something you accept from like an external circumstance that comes to you, and you have no choice. Like you have to, if you want to keep on living a meaningful existence, you have to die. But if there is no need, if there is no external need, to what are you exactly giving your life? I mean, what are you exactly accepting if there is no need or no construction from the reality? In this way, I don't see this kind of martyrdom as an imitation, an imitatio Christi, because from a Christian point of view, your flesh is not your own, so you have no right to give your body unless there is an external cause. And this external cause is what I really don't see in Weil's case. Because if you don't want to, I mean, if you don't want to eat, you are going to be a useless instrument for any cause in this world. So.
Okay, there's too much points to explain, but I think the difference between the difference that I established between suicide and martyr is complicated because it has too much points. For me, the main point was that it was not on the act of killing yourself or letting you die, because it was like kind of a process that crossed your life also. And I want to situate the difference in the meaning, because I think that the meaninglessness is already a meaning, and that's why I put the difference in the cause or in the meaning that transcends yourself, or it's in yourself, and it didn't remains. So I think for me, meaninglessness is already a meaning, because I think for me I think you need to have some meaning. At least the meaning of your life is a no meaning existence. That is one point. And on the other hand, the problem with Weil is that it's very interesting, the life of Simone Weil, written by Simone Petron, because she was an intimate friend of hers. And in this book, she explained that Simone Weil didn't have desire of death, even when she didn't eat. The most of the times it was because this food, she couldn't digest properly the food, and the food was like bad for him, because she was in a poor health conditions. And also she point out that she was at the hospital. So if she would have had an intention or a desire for death, she could have ate a pill or something like that to kill herself. So and also there are like text. Well, I'm not going to search, but there are like text and sentences in which she said, I don't want to die, I want to live, I think I'm going to be better. There are also other ones that said the opposite, but there are these sentences and there are these words in Simone Weil. So I think she had like a kind of sensibility with the disgrace in the world, and this is why she didn't want to have any privilege, because she was a privileged person. She came from a privileged family, and her family was all the time trying to take care of her and trying to give to her money. She was she was a privileged person, and she didn't want to be in that position, because the war was in a fatal moment. She lived all these wars, all these conditions, all these all these situations. So I don't know if I had answered your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have just time for one more question. Alison?
Hi. It's too early here for me to have my camera on yet, but I will later. And my question is sort of related, and also brings Diego's presentation back into the conversation. But so political theory literature, in line with Nemembe, and more recently, Banu Bargo's work on necro-resistance, have gone through really, really great lengths to distinguish the martyr and necro-resistance from what they call the personal suicide. And because Diego was bringing up Foucault and Deleuze, I wonder whether under conditions of our present moment defined by biopower, to what extent this distinction is still useful. So to what extent do you think it could be meaningful to conceive of the personal suicide under a biopolitical injunction to live as a resistant act with meaning related outside of itself?
I don't know if I don't know if I understand the question properly. Like the question itself.
So, I mean, I think it is more related to the other question about to what extent, given current political conditions and the way that power is sort of operating oppressively at all times against all bodies, whether the distinction between the martyr and the personal suicide is still as relevant as it was or as meaningful, and to what extent we can give the personal suicide a more transcendent universal meaning.
Okay. I think that I understand that if this distinction is also working in a political level, kind of.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a great question because I think I thought of my talk more in an ontological point of view than in a political. But I think, for example, in Weil, it is not separated because her ontological or more metaphysical or theological point of view, which this concept, the creation, is in a total connection with her political position. Maybe the key point that it could be translated to the political dimension is when the meaning and the cause and the why of your life is outside of yourself, it's in the collective, and I think this changed everything because we are in a society that is so much individualist. So if we if in our life the position of the meaning is outside ourselves, it is situated in the group, in the collective, in the other, and in the other ones that suffer the most, that they had worse material conditions, and we fight for this because it's the meaning of our life. I think there we can see this translation, this political translation in Simone Weil, that I wanted to establish this difference between suicide and martyrdom, just for applicating to Simone Weil. So I think there it could be a translation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Myriam, and congratulations for your presentation. We are going to move to the last presentation of this panel, which is Suicide and Sophie's Choice by Robyn Gaier. Gaier is a lecturer of philosophy at Youngstown State University in Youngstown, Ohio, and earned a doctorate degree in philosophy from St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri, and have research interests in ethics, moral psychology, and philosophy of mind. So you are the last one this morning, Robyn?
Yes, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I am attempting to share my presentation. All right, so sorry about that. So thank you so very much for this conference, Josefa. This is really well organized, so thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm learning so much from the presentation, so thank you so much. So my presentation is on suicide and William Styron's Sophie's Choice. And as I mentioned, I put my personal email up there because I am changing affiliations. Beginning in August, I'll be at Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania. Okay, so a little bit of background. First of all, So the background is just that suicide is commonly regarded as a choice. This false belief seems to contribute to the social stigma against suicide. So obviously, suicide as being distinguished from, other types of death by accident or illness or homicide. So it is commonly thought to just to obviously involve choice. So my thesis is that looking at William Styron's work exemplifies how, though intentional, at least some actions of suicide ought not to be regarded as choices. Now, my background is in philosophy by training, and so there's this big philosophical problem then, and that is the problem of how to understand intentionality in the absence of choice. So how do we understand suicide as being different than these other types of death, by dying by one's own hand, and yet being absent of choice? That seems at the surface paradoxical. And so here's where William Styron's work, most notably Darkness Visible, A Memoir of Madness, which was published in 1990, and Sophie's Choice, which was published in 1979, perhaps his most famous work, can help at least to try to help with this paradox. How do we understand intentionality in the absence of choice? So as an outline of my presentation, in the first part, I just want to understand the nature of choice, try to just lay that out bare bones. I'm not trying to be in any sense very complicated by this. I want to appeal to our very quick understanding of this. In the second part, I am looking at Styron's account of suffering from suicidal ideation in conjunction with his severe depression, how in the grip of his depression, suicide is not a choice. So there are various elements in his memoir, Darkness Visible, that speak to the idea that suicide is not a choice. And lastly, Sophie's Choice, his own novel there, and moral injury. I want to say a little bit about that later on, but how even in the absence of mental illness, suicide is not a choice. Okay, so the first part, understanding the nature of choice. Again, just very bare bones, very just sort of trying to appeal to what do we mean when we talk about choice. And so really just to be presented with one or more options to pursue or to refuse, right? So if you have an option to either you can do this or you cannot do this, that's making a choice. I mean, just very, at the very surface level. But obviously we can dig further, and we should dig further on this. And so ideally it is assumed that one weighs alternatives and considers the consequence of each option, as it were, or even the option of refraining to do the action, so that there's some kind of deliberation, or at least some kind of reason to prefer one option over the other. And the other part of that, ideally, is that it is further assumed that what one chooses expresses their will or desire. That is to say, if, I paint walls red, I desire to paint walls red. Like, I am choosing that because that expresses my will. But we know in practice that things are never ideal. So we do accept some limitation on choice. So I want to make a caveat here that there are limitations on choices. Admittedly, choices are limited. They're limited by circumstance, abilities, means. We can't just choose whatever at any time. So that's, pretty clear, pretty straightforward. But even admittedly, choices may not adequately express one's will or desire. So for instance, think about choosing the lesser of two evils, or choosing against an option rather than choosing for an option. So oftentimes, at least politically, at least in a two-party system, some voters may say that they're choosing against a candidate rather than choosing for a candidate. So that would be where we sort of recognize that choices in reality are not ideal, and so they're not always going to necessarily express one's will. However, having said that, having acknowledged that, excessive limitations eradicate choice. We recognize collectively, I assume, that, where there's coercion, where there's duress, where someone does not have the freedom to do otherwise, that there is no choice in the matter. And so when there's significant limitations, we say, well, okay, that, therefore there's no choice. So what I want to say here about choices, very, very quick and sort of still at the surface level, is two things. First, that a choice involves an option, that both options should be weighed. Again, either to do something or to refuse to do something. And that in some sense, they're an expression of one's will. So in some sense, I mean, even choosing the lesser of two evils, you're still expressing a will in some sense. And so that's important for what I want to say about Styron's work, because I think that both those elements of choice are missing in both his account of depression as a mental illness, which led to his suicidal thinking, and his account of Sophie in his novel Sophie's Choice. So let me start with Styron. And Styron's account, again, in his memoir, Darkness Visible. First of all, obviously, it's his memoir about his experiences battling depression as a mental illness. At one point, he likens battling depression as a mental illness and giving, like, having those suicidal thoughts which come out of that. He likens that to being a person suffering from terminal cancer. And he says that a victim of suicide, that is someone who dies by suicide, he says there should be no more reproof attached to the victim of terminal cancer. The other part of in his memoir is that he talks about what he calls these sinister hallmarks of depression. So this is confusion, memory loss, and lack of focus. So he says that, these are hallmarks of depression that go unnoticed by the person suffering from depression, but of course other people recognize them, but they're also deeply interfering with his agency. So I'll give an example later on, but he talks about how, just confusion, mental or memory loss, and lack of focus can obviously impact what he was being asked to do. And then importantly, in Darkness Visible, he talks about how he experienced a fragmentation of his agency. He experienced what he called this wrath-like observer. And so it was like what I'm calling here a second self. And in his memoir, he says that he's not the only one that has had this experience. And he says, like, look, there's this double self. And so to illustrate that, he talks about this idea of melodrama, where neither the actor nor the lone audience member gets to write the script. What I'm appealing to there is in a passage where he says, quote, "I couldn't shake off the sense of melodrama, a melodrama in which I, the victim to be of self-murder, was both the solitary actor and the lone member of the audience." And then finally, he says that time is the real healer. This is what he actually refers to in a New York Times op-ed that he wrote in 1988 on why Primo Levi need not have died. And that was a precursor to his memoir. And he says that, if time is the real healer to get past the suicidal thinking, then that shows that suicidal thinking was not part of this choice, that it wasn't a product of choice. So just to be clear, suicide or Styron on suicide ideation, in his memoir, from those brief examples, which I can talk about more during the Q&A, but basically to say that his suicide ideation was not a consequence of rational deliberation, nor impulsive. It's interesting that he says that he thinks that suicide is rarely out of impulse. So that I think it is important, at least if we're trying to make this distinction between intentional action and choice. He says that it was not a product of a unified will. This is that fragmentation or second self. So it can't express a will if the will itself is fragmented or broken. And so the example that I want to give here, the luncheon embarrassment, where he was accepting a prestigious award in Paris, and yet he had made alternative plans for a luncheon that was going to be in his honor, and he deems that back to the sinister hallmarks of depression, just memory loss and forgetfulness, and he wanted to just say, like, look, this is part of the depression. And then he also talked about his inspiration in his recovery. So after he published Darkness Visible, after he published that, he was getting a lot of invitations to talk about his recovery. So moving on to Sophie's Choice, which, again, is a very complex novel, but I want to talk about actually 3 choices that Sophie is faced with in that novel. The first is maternal love and refusal to participate in resistance efforts against the Nazis. So because of her love for her 2 children, though she sympathized obviously with the resistance efforts, she didn't want to participate in them. That's a choice she makes kind of more earlier on in the novel. The main choice that Sophie's Choice is, of course, recognized with is that maternal love and needing to sacrifice one child so that the other might live. So the idea was that when she is presented with this choice of, which child goes immediately to be murdered, and, she says, I can't obviously make that choice, but not making that choice means that both children are murdered at the hands of the Nazis immediately. So she sacrifices one child, and that gives her this profound guilt as being an accomplice in the murder of her own child. And so Styron foreshadows her death by suicide throughout the novel, but we can see that choice here is a misnomer in Sophie's Choice, that Sophie's maternal love is part of Sophie's identity. It is core to Sophie's sense of self. So Sophie is forced to betray her maternal love. In doing so, Sophie betrays herself beyond repair. As her sense of self is shattered, she suffers a moral injury. So the idea here is that out of maternal love, out of trying to at least save the life of one child, she's forced to make this impossible choice, right? Of which of her 2 children should be murdered. No loving parent can make such a choice. And so moral injury, there's a lot written on that, but basically the idea is that the injury part of it, I'll take that first, the injury part of it is a transgression. It's a betrayal. The moral part of it is that it is a betrayal of something core to oneself. So it's not the idea of, oh, I want to go on a diet and then, oh, I broke my diet and I betrayed myself. That's not the idea, obviously. The idea is that I betrayed something that is core to who I am. And because of that, I am no longer me. I am no longer myself. So due to her brokenness, suicide becomes a formality. It is interesting because in Styron's work on his op-ed, why Primo Levi ought not or need not have died, that he wrote in 1988. It's interesting that he has in there that the torment that precipitates the act, that is the act of suicide, makes it often one of blind necessity. So I'm not sure, go back with the slides. I'm not sure what's happening there, but anyway, the horrific circumstances, the trauma that Sophie endured, it's not a consequence of rational deliberation nor impulsive. It was a product of her brokenness. So her suicide does not surprise anyone in reading the novel. And so it's not an expression of her will, because her sense of self is already lost. And that actually ties in really well with what Styron talks about in his memoir, Darkness Visible, with the idea that loss is really just emanates depression. So loss of appetite, loss of sleep, loss of, like, even grief, like this kind of idea that depression itself is this kind of loss. So you might ask at this point, sort of, well, isn't there like this chicken and egg problem? Like, what if Sophie just was depressed? And so maybe Sophie's case is just like William Styron's case. And of course, I want to push back a little bit on that, because in the op-ed, again, where Styron's writing about Primo Levi's death by suicide, he does actually bring up this idea of this chicken and egg problem. Like, was it that Primo Levi suffered from, suffered from depression, or was it his experiences in Auschwitz that, really had participated and really, were behind his death by suicide? And actually, Styron leaves it an open question. He says, actually, what we should be concerned about is just treating persons with, this kind of fragmented sense of self, however we find it. So I think it's important. That's an important insight there, to recognize that, again, Sophie's choice, it's a play on words, but it's a misnomer. It's not her choice, even just like her choice of trying to choose which child is immediately murdered, it's an impossible choice for her. So is her choice, quote unquote, to die by suicide. It's sort of this, what Styron referred to as a blind necessity. So that leaves us with this paradox, right? From a philosophical background, right? How can we have intentional action without choice? Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think that choice ought to reflect autonomy, and at the very least, I think, there ought to be some kind of understanding of options, that is, alternate possibilities, either to do or to refrain. But there also has to be some kind of coherent understanding of self. So again, I don't know, a coherent understanding of self. That is to say that there needs to be some kind of expression of will. Because remember, when those two are absent, like under, say, coercion, we don't call any kind of choice, quote unquote, made under coercion to be a choice. Now, I think there's still room to say that there's intentional action, because intentional action does not need to rely upon a unified sense of self or a unified will. So, we can kind of just see that in maybe like animals or children, or sorry again, or just this kind of acting on blind necessity. You're still acting, so you can still have that kind of intentional choice. And then finally, sorry, don't want to get too much here, but I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know. Anyway, Styron's works, most notably Darkness Visible and Sophie's Choice, help to provide an avenue not only for understanding how suicide may not be a choice to the sufferer of depression, but also, and importantly, how suicide may not be a choice to someone who does not suffer from depression as a mental illness. So that's sort of the upshot of what I want to do in my paper. So again, thank you for the time. Thank you for the conference.
Thank you so very much, Robyn. Your presentations make me think a lot always, and I'm not sure if this is a good thing. because my man is completely crazy. I'm broken right now. So, thank you for sure for being here with us at your early morning. It's about 8 a.m. in the United States. So thank you for your effort. I'm not sure if there is any question. We have a couple of minutes for some question.
Oh, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I would say, one of the things that Styron really highlights is that depression, at least his experience of severe depression, is this unbearable pain. And he says, unless someone has experienced that, they really don't know. And I think, Sophie's own pain of, to make matters worse, she has 2 children. So she has Jan and Eva. Eva's the younger daughter. And so Eva is the one who is immediately murdered. But Jan, her son, doesn't make it either. Right. So she's made this impossible choice out of maternal love to sacrifice a child for one of them, right? So that they both don't die, and betraying her own maternal love in that, and yet not being able to be with her son, even not being able to, so it was, I think it also speaks to that unbearable pain. I couldn't imagine, but I know, with losing a child is horrific, and to say that you're part of that as well. I mean, that that to her, especially when it was part of her identity, and I think that's also like what Styron is getting at in his depression. Like, it was this unbearable pain, and so I do think that when someone is suffering this unbearable pain, they can intentionally, choose suicide, not as itself, but as a means of ending this unbearable pain. Because what I want to say is the option of a life without that unbearable pain is unimaginable. And so that's not even on the table as like, oh, but I could also not do this. And if I not, it's, so, and I think if we allow that to be like one of the elements of choice, to say that, well, you at least know that there's another option, or you can, you could die by suicide or not die by suicide, and that not die by suicide is as equally weighed in your mind. Like, and I want to say, we don't see that in Styron's discussion of depression. We don't see that in Sophie, in the character of Sophie either. We see this brokenness. We see this unbearable pain. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
yeah, I'm not sure either if this conference is serving to to helping us with better understanding suicide, or we are just placing more questions than answers. But it's a good thing to think about. Just one more question, very quickly, you see.
Yes, I'll try to be very, very short. When the intentional action is without choice, I mean, when there is no choice, and so you are brought into doing something, but you don't have choice, it seems to me that this moves the attention from the one that actually commits suicide to everything what is around the one who commits suicide, and this shift, takes into consideration not just the individual, but more just society, collective responsibilities, which is maybe something that goes in the direction of understanding why someone, commits suicides and how. I mean, do I understand it?
yes.
It's a big change, in fact. It's a big change of perspective. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, yes. Thank you for that. I would certainly agree with that. This kind of necessity that that Styron talks about is this sort of pointing to situational factors. That's why he after he published Darkness Visible, he felt compelled. He even referred to it as like a type of missionary work to actually go and speak to people that have had similar experiences, or that Darkness Visible, the memoir, really resonated with them. And so he said, yeah, I want to be able to share my story and give hope. So he was, he wanted it to be hopeful. But I do think that, his situation, like seeing depression as a mental illness, not just the everyday depression, is certainly a situational factor, as is the case of Sophie's choice. And then to be even more ambitious, I think your comment definitely resonates with his other work as well. So, he wrote about war, he wrote about slavery. And so to see these very situational factors as playing into part of this narrative that we need to have on the table when we discuss about suicide, I think that's so very true, and gets to the sociological aspect of suicide. Yes, so thank you.
Thank you very much.